In this video, we're going to cover 40 essential English phrasal verbs, which, when used correctly, will make you sound more natural, more fluent, and more like a native English speaker. But first, before anything else, be sure to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and turn on your notifications for free English lessons. Now let's begin. You see, English speakers use phrasal verbs all the time in everyday conversations. Think of them like words that are put together to make a different meaning. We've handpicked 40 phrasal verbs that are super useful for everyday use in this video. We'll break them down, provide clear examples, and show you how to use them confidently in different contexts. But first, what are phrasal verbs anyway? Put simply, phrasal verbs are 2 or 3 words which consist of a main verb followed by 1 or more particles, which are typically prepositions or adverbs. Now, the meaning of a phrasal verb is often different from the individual meanings of the words that make it up, or its components, making them a bit challenging for learners of English. So, to help you understand them better, we'll dive into some examples. Don't forget to please comment down below a phrasal verb you've never heard before, but you're learning for the first time in this video. Okay, so let's begin. Our first phrasal verb is run into. To run into someone means to encounter or meet them unexpectedly. You usually use them when you are meeting somebody who you didn't think that you were going to meet at that particular period in time. Here's our first example. I ran into my friend at the cinema. I haven't seen him in a long time. Our next example. If you run into my mom at the office, please tell her I will be home soon. Our next phrasal verb is figure out. To figure out means to understand or solve a problem. Here's our first example. I need some time to figure out the solution to this problem. Next example, she couldn't figure out how to assemble the furniture without the instructions. Our third phrasal verb is hand out. To hand out means to distribute or to give something to a group of people. Here's our first example. Please hand out the worksheets to the students. Next example, they started to hand out free samples of their new product at the store. Now, our next phrasal verb is ask around. To ask around means to inquire or get information from various people. Okay, so it has to be more than one person. Here's our first example. I'll ask around to see if anyone knows where your lost keys are. Here's our next example. If you're lost, ask around for directions. Our next phrasal verb is doze off. To doze off means to fall asleep unintentionally for a short while. So it usually happens when you are either sitting down or maybe you're standing up even, and you suddenly fall asleep and you weren't intending to or you didn't plan to. Here's our first example. I dozed off during the boring movie. Here's our next example. Don't doze off in class. Pay attention. Our next phrasal verb is fall behind. To fall behind means to be slow or fail to keep up with a pace or schedule. Here's our first example. I fell behind in my coursework and I need to catch up. Here's our next example. The team fell behind schedule due to unexpected delays. Our next phrasal verb is pay off. To pay off is to give positive results or bring a beneficial outcome. Here's our first example. All the hard work paid off when she passed the exam with flying colors. Here's our next example. Investing in education can pay off in the long run with better job opportunities. Now, our next English phrasal verb is look forward to. To look forward to means to anticipate or be excited about something in the future. Here's our first example. I look forward to meeting you at the conference next week. Here's our next example. We look forward to our annual family reunion. Our next phrasal verb is give up. To give up means to quit or stop trying. Here's our first example. Don't give up on your dreams. Keep working hard. Here's our next example. He gave up smoking after years of trying to quit. Our next phrasal verb is brush up. To brush up means to refresh or improve one's knowledge or skills. So you usually use this phrasal verb when you've forgotten something that you've already learned in the past and you want to remember it again. So you may have to go through the learning process again. So here's our first example. I need to brush up on my Spanish before my trip to Mexico. Here's our next example. He decided to brush up on his guitar playing over the summer. Our next English phrasal verb is do over. To do over means to redo or repeat a task or activity. Okay, so you have to do it again. Do over. Here's our first example. The chef had to do over the recipe to get it right. Here's our next example. I need to do over my presentation because of the technical glitch. Our next English phrasal verb is eat out. To eat out means to dine in a restaurant instead or anywhere else instead of at home. Our first example is, let's eat out tonight and try that new Italian restaurant. Here's our second example. They usually eat out on special occasions. Our next English phrasal verb is fall through. To fall through means to fail, to happen, or be completed as planned. Here's our first example. Our vacation plans fell through due to unforeseen circumstances. Here's our next example. The deal with the client fell through at the last minute. So again, to fall through means it didn't happen. Okay? Now, our next English phrasal verb is give away. To give away means to provide something for free or to reveal a secret. So here it has two meanings. Okay, so here's our first example. She gave away free samples of their new product at the event. Here's our next example. She accidentally gave away the surprise party plans. Our next English phrasal verb is let down. To let down means to disappoint someone by failing to meet their expectations. Here's our first example. I hate to let you down, but I can't make it to the party tonight. Here's our next example. The team let down their coach by losing the championship game. Our next English phrasal verb is make out. To make out means to try to understand something, often in challenging circumstances. So it isn't easy to understand, but you can make it out when you really make an effort to. Okay, so here's our first example. It was hard to make out the words in the dimly lit room. Here's our next example. Can you make out the details in this blurry photograph? Our next English phrasal verb is wake up to. To wake up to means to become aware of or realize something, often unexpectedly. Here's our first example. I woke up to the fact that I needed to change my unhealthy lifestyle. So in this example, it's like you suddenly realized. Okay? Now, our next example is, many people woke up to the importance of environmental conservation. Our next English phrasal verb is break in. To break in means to enter a building or property illegally, often with the intent to commit a crime. Here's our first example. Someone tried to break in through the back door last night. Here's our next example. It's essential to have good security to prevent break-ins. Our next English phrasal verb is catch on. To catch on means to understand or become popular or accepted. Here's our first example. It took a while, but he finally caught on to the new software. Here's our next example. The latest fashion trend is starting to catch on with the young people. Our next English phrasal verb is count on. To count on means to rely or depend on someone or something. Here's our first example. You can count on me to help you with the project. Here's our next example. I'm counting on the weather to be good for our outdoor event. So again, to count on means to rely or depend on someone or something. Our next English phrasal verb is get along. To get along means to have a good relationship or rapport with someone. Okay, so that's how you pronounce that word, rapport. You don't pronounce the T. Now here's our first example. My siblings and I get along very well. Here's our next example. Do you think they will get along at the conference? Our next English phrasal verb is hang around. To hang around means to spend time in a particular place without a specific purpose. Here's our first example. Teenagers like to hang around the mall on weekends. Here's our next example. I'll just hang around the park until you're ready to leave. Our next English phrasal verb is look up to. To look up to means to admire and respect someone. Here's our first example. She has always looked up to her older sister as a role model. Here's our next example. Many people look up to him for his achievements in science. Now here's our next phrasal verb, turn down. The turn down means to decline or reject an offer or request. Here's our first example. She had to turn down the job offer due to scheduling conflicts. Here's our next example. He turned down their invitation to the party. So again, to turn down means to decline or reject an offer or request. Here's our next phrasal verb, bring up. To bring up means to raise a topic or mention something for discussion. Here's our first example. I didn't want to bring up the subject of money, but we need to talk about it. Here's our next example. She brought up an interesting point during the meeting. So as you can see, brought up here is the past tense of bring up. Now, our next English phrasal verb is clean up. To clean up means to tidy or make something clean and orderly. Here's our first example. We need to clean up the kitchen after dinner. Here's our next example. The volunteers helped clean up the park after the event. Our next English phrasal verb is do up. To do up means to fasten or close something securely. Here's an example. Can you help me do up the zipper on my dress? Here's our next example. He did up all the buttons on his shirt. Our next English phrasal verb is find out. To find out means to discover or gather information about something. Here's our first example. I want to find out more about the history of this town. Here's our next example. I found out that he had won the lottery. Our next English phrasal verb is get ahead. To get ahead means to make progress or achieve success in one's career or life. Here's our first example. To get ahead in the corporate world, you need to work hard. Here's our next example. She worked extra hours to get ahead on her project. Now, our next English phrasal verb is make do with. To make do with means to manage or cope with something that is less than ideal. So it may be something that you may not really like, but it's something that you have to just accept. So here's an example. We didn't have all the ingredients, so we had to make do with what we had. Here's our next example. She had to make do with a temporary workspace while her office was under renovation. Our next English phrasal verb is pay back. To pay back means to return money or a favor that was owed to someone. Here's our first example. I'll pay you back the money I borrowed as soon as I can. Here's our next example. She wanted to pay back her friend for all the help and support. Our next English phrasal verb is pick out. To pick out means to choose or select from a group of options. Here's our first example. She couldn't decide, so I helped her pick out a dress for the party. Here's our next example. Can you pick out the best candidate for the job from the list? Our next English phrasal verb is keep in. To keep in means to restrain or not disclose information or emotions. So here's our first example. She finds it hard to keep her feelings in when she's upset. Here's our next example. Please keep this information in until we make an official announcement. So as you can see from these examples, you put the noun, like in this sentence, information. You keep this information in. So you put a noun in the middle of keep in to describe what you are trying to hide. Okay? Now, our next English phrasal verb is lay out. To lay out means to present or display something in a clear and organized manner. Here's our first example. She laid out all the details of the plan in a presentation. He laid out the ingredients neatly on the kitchen counter. Our next English phrasal verb is pick on. To pick on means to unfairly target or criticize someone repeatedly. Here's the first example. The older kids used to pick on him when he was in school, so you can use the word pick on instead of the word bully. Next example, it's not right to pick on someone just because they're different. Our next English phrasal verb is find out. To find out means to discover or learn information about something. Here's our first example. I need to find out what time the event starts. Here's our next example. She found out the truth about her family history. Our next English phrasal verb is live up to. To live up to means to meet or fulfill expectations or standards. Here's our first example. She always strives to live up to her parents' expectations. Here's our next example. The new product must live up to customer demands. Our next English phrasal verb is settle for. To settle for means to accept something less than what was originally desired. Here's our first example. I couldn't find my preferred brand, so I settled for an alternative. Here's our next example. Sometimes you have to settle for second place in a competition. Now our last phrasal verb is stand by. To stand by means to offer support or remain loyal to someone. Here's our first example. I'll stand by you no matter what happens. Here's our next example. The company promised to stand by its customers in times of need. Okay, so there you have it. Now you have 40 phrasal verbs that you can use in your daily English conversations. Be sure to rewind and return to this video again and remember to practice and use them. Just to check if you really learned something from this video, please do comment your favorite phrasal verb down below, or at least one that you can remember. Okay, thank you for watching this far, and I hope to see you next time. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell. See ya!